What if fear controlled your town? What if no one dared to stand up? But what happens when someone finally says, "Enough"? Tonight, one man steps up. He's not afraid. But can he really change everything? Watch till the end to find out. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what would you do? The cool evening air settled over the small town as John Cena walked through its quiet streets, stretching his legs after the intense WWE event earlier that night. He had always enjoyed visiting new places, experiencing the energy of a different town, and taking a moment to unwind after a long match. Tonight was no different. As he strolled through the unfamiliar streets, he noticed a park ahead, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It looked peaceful, the kind of place where he could sit and enjoy a quiet moment to himself. John stepped onto the pathway, taking in the surroundings. The park was lively, filled with people enjoying their evening. Children ran around, laughing and playing, while families strolled leisurely along the pathways. A group of teenage boys played basketball on a nearby court, their excited shouts and the rhythmic sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement filling the air. Couples sat on benches, lost in conversation, and older folks walked their dogs, nodding at passers-by. It was a simple, comforting scene, and John felt himself relax as he searched for a spot to sit. Finding an empty bench near the fountain, he took a seat and pulled out a book. It was a habit of his to carry something to read, especially when he found himself in a quiet place like this. He opened the book and began to read, letting the background noise of the park blend into a soothing ambiance. For a while, everything felt normal. The distant laughter, the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze, the casual conversations, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Then something changed. John noticed it first as a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The voices around him grew quieter. The energy of the park, once vibrant and full of life, began to drain. He looked up from his book, his eyes scanning the area. A woman sitting nearby quickly scooped up her child and hurried away, glancing over her shoulder nervously. A couple that had been walking together stopped abruptly, turned around and left in the opposite direction. Even the boys playing basketball hesitated, their game pausing mid-motion as they exchanged wary glances. One by one, they abandoned the court, leaving the ball rolling aimlessly across the pavement. John frowned. He watched as more people quietly but hastily exited the park. It wasn't a sudden panic, but it was deliberate. No one was running or screaming, but their movements carried a sense of urgency. They were getting out of there as fast as they could without making a scene. Something was wrong. Just then, he noticed a boy, one of the basketball players, walking briskly past him, gripping the ball tightly. The boy, around 12 or 13 years old, was moving with his head slightly lowered, his eyes darting from side to side. Unlike the others, he wasn't running away immediately, but he clearly wanted to leave. John called out to him, "Hey, kid!" The boy hesitated, looking up. His face was tense, his body rigid with unease. "What's going on? Why is everyone leaving?" The boy swallowed, shifting nervously on his feet. He glanced over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening, then turned back to John. "You should go too," he said quietly. "It's not safe to be here." John raised an eyebrow. "Not safe? What do you mean?" The boy hesitated again, gripping the basketball even tighter. Then, with a quick, uneasy nod, he motioned toward the fountain. John followed the boy's gaze and immediately saw them. A group of men stood near the fountain, their presence unmistakably menacing. They were all dressed similarly. White tank tops stretched over their muscular frames, arms covered in tattoos, heads either shaved or closely cropped. They stood casually, yet there was something controlled about their posture, something that made it clear they weren't just hanging around for a friendly chat. Their eyes scanned the park, their expressions unreadable but cold. John instantly understood. "Who are they?" he asked the boy, keeping his voice calm but firm. The boy exhaled shakily. "They're a gang. They run this town. Everyone's afraid of them." John studied the men carefully. They didn't seem to be in a hurry, but the mere sight of them had emptied the park within minutes. They didn't need to shout or threaten anyone. People already knew what they were capable of. "They collect money from stores," the boy continued in a hushed voice. "They take whatever they want. And if someone doesn't pay up," he hesitated before finishing, "they make sure they regret it." John clenched his jaw. "And you? Have they done something to you?" The boy hesitated before nodding. "They hurt my dad. We moved here a few months ago, and they told us we didn't belong." John's gaze darkened. "They beat him up," the boy continued. "Told him if we didn't leave, things would get worse." Before John could respond, a deep, mocking voice rang out. "Well, well, look who's still here." The boy stiffened. John turned his head and saw one of the men from the group stepping toward them. He was bigger than the others, his broad chest covered in faded tattoos, his head shaved completely. His thick arms flexed as he cracked his knuckles. "I thought I told you," the man sneered, staring at the boy, "that your kind isn't welcome here." The boy's fingers dug into the basketball. He took a step back. John's expression remained calm, but inside he felt a slow burn of anger. The man's eyes finally flicked to John, sizing him up. There was a flicker of recognition, but it didn't seem to concern him. "And who the hell are you?" he asked, narrowing his gaze. John closed his book and placed it beside him on the bench. He didn't stand up yet, but his posture shifted slightly, just enough to make it clear that he wasn't intimidated. "I'm a friend," John said simply, "and I don't like bullies." The man chuckled. "A friend, huh? Well, let me give you some advice, friend. Take your book and get the hell out of here before things get messy." John didn't move. The boy was still standing behind him, tense and afraid. The man sighed, shaking his head. "Suit yourself." Then, without warning, he lunged forward, reaching for the boy. The boy barely had time to react before a strong hand grabbed the man's wrist, John's hand. The grip was firm, unyielding. The man froze, surprised by the strength behind it. He tried to yank his arm free, but John didn't let go. The gang leader's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his shock with a sneer. "You got a problem?" he growled. John stood up slowly, towering over him. His grip remained tight. "I do," John said, his voice calm but unwavering, "and so do you." The tension crackled in the air. The gang leader's lips curled into a smirk. "You don't know who you're messing with." John's grip tightened just slightly. "Neither do you." The man yanked his arm back with force, finally breaking free. He took a step back, sizing John up again. Then he smirked. "If you don't leave right now," he said slowly, his voice dripping with menace, "you won't like what happens next." John glanced at the boy, who was staring up at him wide-eyed. Then, looking back at the gang leader, he simply said, "I'm not going anywhere." The man's smirk faded. Behind him, his crew was already starting to move. The fight was coming, and John Cena was ready. The gang leader took a step back, shaking out his wrist where John Cena had gripped him moments ago. His expression was one of amusement, but there was an undercurrent of irritation in his eyes. His crew, still lingering by the fountain, had taken notice of the confrontation. Some of them leaned forward slightly, their interest piqued. Others cracked their knuckles, anticipating what might come next. John could feel the tension thickening. The boy behind him stood rigid, gripping his basketball tightly as if it were his only anchor in the moment. The gang leader let out a chuckle, shaking his head. "You got some balls, man," he muttered. "Most people in this town know better than to stand in my way." John didn't respond. He just stood his ground, watching. The man took this as a challenge, rolling his shoulders and stepping forward again, closing the gap between them. He was big, but not bigger than John. Still, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been questioned, someone who believed himself untouchable. "You must be new around here," the man continued, his voice dropping lower. "So, let me explain how things work. This is my town, my rules. People pay what I say they pay, they walk where I say they walk, and if someone like you, some out-of-towner, thinks they can just waltz in and play hero," he sneered, tilting his head, "well, that's when people start getting hurt." John's jaw tensed slightly, but he remained silent. The gang leader mistook his silence for hesitation and smirked. "So, here's what's going to happen," the man went on, his tone turning almost conversational. "You're going to take a step back, turn around, and get the hell out of my sight. You do that, and I'll pretend I never saw you." John exhaled slowly. "And the kid?" he asked evenly. The gang leader chuckled again, but this time there was no humor in it. "He stays out of my way, or he learns the hard way, just like his old man." At those words, the boy flinched behind John. John's patience had limits. He took a single step forward. It wasn't aggressive, not yet, but it was enough to make the gang leader tense. "Let me explain something to you," John said, his voice calm but firm. "This park? It doesn't belong to you. These people? They don't belong to you. And if you think you can just push them around, then maybe you're the one who needs to learn something." The gang leader's smirk faltered. A few feet away, one of his men muttered something under his breath. Another took a step forward, his muscles bunching beneath his shirt. The whole group was shifting now, responding to the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. The gang leader glanced at them, then back at John. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, shaking his head. "You're standing in the middle of a city that I own. No one here's gonna back you up. They're scared. And they should be." As if to prove his point, he turned his head slightly and locked eyes with a nearby shop owner who had stepped outside to see the commotion. The man immediately looked away, turning back inside and shutting his door. A woman across the street quickly ushered her child along, keeping her gaze fixed on the ground. Even the few remaining people in the park hurried their steps, avoiding eye contact. John saw it clearly now. The town had been living in fear for a long time. The gang leader let out a satisfied sigh. "See that?" He spread his arms. "That's power. That's what you don't have." John exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Then he looked down at the boy beside him. "Go home, kid," he said gently. The boy's eyes widened. "But—" John gave him a reassuring nod. "I've got this." The boy hesitated, then, gripping his basketball, took a cautious step back. He knew better than to argue. The gang leader watched with mild amusement. "Smart move. Now, if you follow his lead, maybe I won't have to break your face." John turned his gaze back to the man. He studied him for a moment, then spoke. "I've met a lot of guys like you," he said. "The ones who think fear is the same as respect. The ones who push people around because it makes them feel strong." The gang leader scoffed. "But there's always one thing guys like you forget," John continued. The man's smirk tightened. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" John's expression didn't change. There's always someone who won't back down. For a moment, the gang leader just stared at him. Then his smirk twisted into something uglier. "Big mistake." Before John could respond, the man lashed out. It was fast, faster than John had expected for someone his size. A brutal right hook, aimed directly at John's jaw. But John was faster. He shifted his weight, dodging the blow by mere inches. The gang leader's fist sailed past his face, and before he could recover, John's hand shot out, catching him by the wrist and twisting. The gang leader grunted, his body jerking involuntarily as John tightened his grip. The men behind him tensed. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the gang leader growled, yanking his arm back forcefully and stumbling a step away. His face twisted in rage. "Get him!" The words were barely out of his mouth before his men rushed forward. John's body reacted on instinct. The first attacker lunged, throwing a sloppy punch. John sidestepped, grabbed his shirt, and used the man's own momentum to flip him over, sending him crashing onto the pavement. Another one came from the side, reaching for a weapon. Something metal, a pipe, or a crowbar. John didn't give him a chance to swing. He surged forward, slamming a forearm into the man's chest and knocking him off balance before driving a knee into his stomach. The man wheezed and dropped his weapon. The third attacker tried to come from behind, but John sensed him before he got too close. He pivoted sharply and slammed an elbow into the man's jaw. The impact sent him staggering backward. The gang leader, seeing his men go down in a matter of seconds, let out a furious roar and charged. This time he didn't bother with fancy moves. He just threw his full weight at John, trying to overpower him. John caught him mid-charge, bracing his legs against the impact. The force was enough to make the pavement scuff beneath his feet, but he held firm. And then he acted. With one smooth motion, he hoisted the man up, lifting him clean off the ground. The gang leader had just enough time to realize what was happening before John slammed him down with a bone-rattling attitude adjustment right onto the pavement. The park fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The gang leader groaned, rolling onto his side, clearly dazed. His remaining men hesitated, their previous confidence draining away rapidly. John straightened, adjusting his stance. His expression was neutral, controlled. "Take your boss," he said flatly, "and get out of here." The men didn't argue. Scrambling to their feet, they grabbed the gang leader by the arms and dragged him away, muttering curses under their breath. They moved fast, disappearing down the street within moments. John exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He turned and found the boy staring at him, his mouth slightly open. "You okay?" John asked. The boy blinked, then slowly nodded. John glanced around. The fear that had been so thick moments ago was still present, but there was something else now, something new. Hope. John looked back at the boy and gave him a small nod. It wasn't over yet, but it was a start. The gang leader groaned as he was dragged away by his men, his body still reeling from the impact of John Cena's attitude adjustment. The other gang members cast uneasy glances at the WWE legend as they retreated, their previous bravado shattered. The park, which had been nearly deserted only moments ago, remained eerily quiet. The few bystanders who had dared to watch from a distance still lingered, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. John stood motionless, watching the gang disappear into the night. His body was still tense, adrenaline humming beneath his skin, but his expression remained unreadable. He had dealt with men like them before, bullies who thrived on fear, who built their power by making others feel powerless. He knew they wouldn't forget what had happened tonight, and he doubted this was the last he would see of them. A small movement caught his attention. He turned to find the boy still standing there, gripping his basketball tightly. His eyes darted between John and the direction the gang had gone, his face a mixture of awe and uncertainty. "You okay?" John asked. The boy nodded, though he still seemed stunned. "Yeah, I think so." John exhaled, glancing around the park. The people who had fled earlier were slowly returning, cautiously stepping out from their hiding places. A shopkeeper peeked out from his storefront, his face lined with worry. A couple whispered to each other on a nearby bench, their eyes darting toward John with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. It was clear that fear still held a tight grip on this town. The boy finally broke the silence. "You really didn't have to do that." John looked down at him. "Yeah, I did." The boy hesitated, then lowered his gaze. "They're not going to forget this. They'll come back." John knew the kid was right. The gang had ruled through intimidation for a long time, and tonight was the first time someone had stood up to them. That kind of humiliation wasn't something men like them took lightly. They would want payback. "What's your name, kid?" John asked. The boy shifted, still gripping his ball. "Jalen." "All right, Jalen," John said, his voice steady. "Let's talk." They moved toward a nearby bench, and Jalen sat down beside John, still fidgeting with the basketball in his hands. His gaze flickered to the ground, as if he were debating whether or not to speak. "My dad tried to stand up to them too," he finally said, his voice quieter now. "Told them we weren't going to let them push us around. Told them we weren't leaving." John listened intently. "They came to our house one night. A bunch of them. Beat him up real bad." Jalen's fingers tightened around the ball. "He was in the hospital for weeks. When he got out, he wasn't the same. He stopped talking about fighting back. Stopped going out much at all." John clenched his jaw, feeling a familiar surge of anger building in his chest. Jalen continued, his voice carrying a weight beyond his years. "They told him if we didn't move out, they'd make sure next time he wouldn't get back up." John's gaze darkened. "And what about the cops?" Jalen let out a bitter laugh. "What cops?" John raised an eyebrow. "They don't do anything," Jalen muttered. "Some of them are scared. Some of them probably get paid off. Either way, they don't help." John looked around at the faces of the people in the park. Some of them had started to move back to their routines, but there was still tension in the air, an unspoken rule of silence and submission. "That's why nobody fights back," Jalen said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know nobody's coming to save them." John exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had seen corruption before, seen what happened when people were abandoned by the systems that were supposed to protect them. It made men like the gang leader feel invincible. But tonight had proven one thing. Fear could be broken. Jalen looked up at him. "What are you going to do now?" John didn't answer right away. He had come to this park looking for a quiet place to read, but now he was knee-deep in something much bigger. He knew he could walk away, leave this town to handle its own problems, but as he looked at Jalen, saw the way his hands still trembled around that basketball, saw the quiet desperation in his eyes, he knew he wouldn't. "I'm going to make sure they don't come after you or your family again," John finally said. Jalen's eyes widened. "How?" John gave him a small smile. "By making sure they know what happens when they mess with the wrong people." Before Jalen could respond, a sharp voice cut through the night air. "Hey!" John turned. A man was jogging toward them, his face lined with concern. He looked to be in his 40s, with broad shoulders and the kind of tired eyes that had seen too much. His gaze flickered to Jalen first, then settled on John. "You all right, son?" the man asked Jalen, his voice steady but strained. "Yeah, Dad," Jalen said quickly. John's eyes narrowed slightly. This was Jalen's father? The man looked strong, but there was something wary about the way he carried himself, as if he had learned to make himself smaller to avoid trouble. The father turned his attention to John. "I saw what you did." John met his gaze. "Yeah?" The man exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You don't know what you just got yourself into." John's lips twitched into a small smirk. "I think I've got a pretty good idea." Jalen's father shook his head. "Look, I appreciate what you did for my boy, I do, but these guys, they don't just let things go. They're gonna come back. They're gonna come after you." John nodded. "Let them." Jalen's father blinked, caught off guard by the sheer confidence in his tone. John stood up, towering over both of them. "I don't scare easy, and I don't like bullies." Jalen's father hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "You really don't know what you're dealing with." John's expression remained steady. "Then why don't you tell me?" The man hesitated before glancing around, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he lowered his voice. "They don't just run the streets," he said. "They've got people in the right places. People who make sure nothing sticks to them." John folded his arms. "That why the cops won't help?" Jalen's father nodded grimly. "They don't just pay people off. They make examples out of anyone who crosses them." John processed this information carefully. It was worse than he thought. This wasn't just a street gang running small-time extortions. This was an organization that had its claws dug deep into the town. Jalen's father sighed. "I don't know who you are, but listen to me. You can still walk away from this, get in your car, leave town, and forget this ever happened." John considered the words carefully. Then he looked at Jalen, at the quiet desperation in his eyes. "No," he said simply. Jalen's father frowned. "No?" John adjusted his wristbands, rolling his shoulders. "I don't walk away from people who need help." Jalen's father stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to gauge whether he was insane or just fearless. Finally, he shook his head with a small, bitter chuckle. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met," he muttered, "or the dumbest." John grinned. "Maybe a little bit of both." Jalen, for the first time that night, smiled. John looked back toward the empty street where the gang had disappeared. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. John Cena stood in the park, his gaze fixed on the empty street where the gang had disappeared. He knew they weren't gone for good. Men like them didn't take humiliation lightly, especially not in front of witnesses. They would regroup, come back, and they wouldn't be alone. That was fine. He had no intention of leaving things unfinished. Jalen stood beside him, still gripping his basketball tightly. His father, a man who had once tried to stand up to the gang and paid the price for it, now looked at John with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "You're serious about this?" Jalen's father finally said. John nodded. "I don't start fights, but I sure as hell finish them." Jalen's father exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "Then you need to understand what you're dealing with. These guys, they're not just some street punks looking for trouble. They've got people watching their backs. The police, they turn a blind eye. The businesses, they pay up because they know no one's coming to save them. You might have scared them tonight, but that won't last. They'll come back, and when they do, they'll come for blood." John folded his arms, his stance unshaken. Then I'll be ready." Jalen's father shook his head. "You don't get it. They don't fight fair. They don't take risks. They'll wait until you're alone, catch you off guard. You need to leave town before it's too late." John looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I've spent my whole life fighting people who think they can intimidate others into submission. And I've learned one thing. They only have power as long as people let them have it. This town is scared, and they have every right to be. But fear isn't real power. People like that, they crumble the moment someone stands up to them and doesn't back down." Jalen's father studied him, then shook his head. "I hope you're right." John turned to Jalen. "You should go home. You and your dad stay inside tonight. Keep the doors locked." Jalen hesitated. "What about you?" John smiled slightly. "I'm going to have a little chat with our friends." Jalen's father let out a frustrated sigh. "You're out of your damn mind, you know that." John's smirk didn't fade. "I get that a lot." Jalen looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just nodded. "Be careful." John watched them go before he turned back toward the street. He had a pretty good idea where the gang would be holed up. If they ran this town the way Jalen said they did, then they had to have a central spot, a place where they felt untouchable. He just had to find it. He left the park and started walking. The town was quiet, unnervingly so. Businesses were closed up, lights dimmed behind curtains, and people kept their heads down. It was the kind of silence that came from years of oppression, from people learning that speaking up only led to trouble. John didn't blend in. He was too big, too well known, and after what had happened in the park, he knew eyes were on him. He didn't care. He wanted them to know he wasn't afraid. He reached a small diner, the neon sign flickering overhead. It was one of the few places still open. He stepped inside, and the few patrons glanced up before quickly looking away. The waitress behind the counter tensed slightly at the sight of him, recognizing who he was. John approached the counter. "Hey," he said casually, "I need some information." The waitress hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window. "I don't want any trouble." John gave her a reassuring look. "Neither do I. I just need to know where they go. The guys who run this town. Where do they hide?" She swallowed, her hands gripping a rag she had been using to wipe the counter. "Why?" "Because they need to learn a lesson," John said simply. The waitress hesitated for a long moment, then sighed. "Warehouse, down by the docks. That's where they meet up when things go south." John nodded. "Thanks." She looked at him, her face filled with concern. "You should leave town, mister. This isn't your fight." John met her gaze. "It is now." He turned and walked out. The docks were on the edge of town, a place that was mostly abandoned at night, perfect for people who wanted to do things without being seen. As John approached, he saw the warehouse in question. The lights inside were on, shadows moving behind the broken windows. He moved in closer, keeping to the edges, listening. He could hear voices, low and angry. He recognized the gang leader's voice immediately. "I don't care who he is," the man was snarling. "He made me look like a damn fool in front of everyone. You think people are scared now? If we don't handle this, we lose everything." One of the others muttered something, but the gang leader cut him off. "No, we're not waiting. He's still in town. That means he's a problem, and I don't like problems, so we handle him tonight." John smirked. He had expected as much. He stepped forward, kicking open the door. The gang members jolted, turning toward him in shock. The gang leader's face twisted into rage as he stood up, fists clenching. "You got some nerve walking in here," the gang leader growled. John stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the room. "I figured we should settle this now, save you the trouble of coming to find me." The gang leader let out a sharp laugh. "You think you can just walk in here and take us all on?" John tilted his head slightly. "I do." The gang leader's smile faded. "Get him!" The men surged forward. John was ready. The first attacker swung, but John ducked, catching him with a powerful uppercut that sent him crashing into a stack of crates. Another rushed him with a crowbar, but John sidestepped and grabbed the weapon mid-swing, yanking it away before slamming an elbow into the man's ribs. The gang leader lunged at him, furious now, swinging wildly. John let him come, dodging the blows before catching him around the waist and lifting him clean off the ground. He turned and slammed him down hard, the impact rattling through the warehouse floor. The remaining men hesitated, their confidence draining fast. John straightened, rolling his shoulders. "Last chance," he said. "Walk away, or I'll put every single one of you down." The gang leader groaned, coughing as he tried to push himself up. His men looked between John and their fallen leader. One by one, they backed off. The gang leader seethed. "This isn't over." John stepped closer, looking down at him. "Yeah, it is." He turned and walked out. As he stepped into the night, he pulled out his phone. He had contacts, people who could make sure the authorities took notice of what was happening here. This town wasn't going to be afraid anymore, and John Cena had just made sure of that. The night was still as John Cena stepped away from the warehouse. His body was tense, adrenaline still humming beneath his skin, but his mind was sharp. The gang had scattered, their leader humiliated for the second time that night. It was a victory, but John knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The town had been living in fear for too long, and fear didn't disappear in a single night. He needed to make sure this change lasted. As he walked back toward the center of town, he could feel eyes on him. Windows cracked open just slightly as people peered out, hesitant but curious. Some shopkeepers had stayed late, their faces pressed against the glass, watching from the safety of their stores. He saw a man standing in the doorway of a bar, arms crossed, shaking his head slightly as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard about. Word was spreading fast. John wasn't sure how long the town had been under the gang's control, but he could see the damage in the way people carried themselves. Shoulders hunched, heads down, a learned behavior of avoiding conflict, avoiding attention. He'd seen it before in places where bullies had been allowed to grow too powerful. The only way to change it was to show people that fear wasn't their only option. He reached the park and saw Jalen and his father waiting near a bench. Jalen's eyes widened when he saw John approaching, and he ran up to him, gripping the basketball in one hand. "You're okay?" Jalen said, relief clear in his voice. John gave him a reassuring nod. "Told you I'd handle it." Jalen's father approached more slowly. He looked John up and down, searching for injuries. "They didn't get to you?" John smirked. "Not for lack of trying." The older man let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand over his face. "You really don't know when to walk away, do you?" John shook his head. "Not when people need help." Jalen's father looked around, lowering his voice. "Listen, you might have scared them off tonight, but you don't understand how deep this goes. Those guys, they answer to someone bigger. The real power isn't on the street. It's in the businesses, the cops, the people who make sure that nothing happens to them. You took out a few soldiers, but the war ain't won." John folded his arms. "Then we take down the people protecting them." Jalen's father scoffed. "You think it's that easy?" John's expression remained steady. "I know it's not, but I've got connections. People who don't look the other way." The man studied him, doubt flickering in his eyes. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. "If you're serious about this, you need proof. Something that forces people to pay attention. Something they can't ignore." John nodded. "Then let's find it." Jalen, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "I think I know where to look." His father frowned. "Jalen." "No, listen," Jalen insisted. "I overheard them once. They were talking about a place where they keep their money, the bribe money. They called it the vault. It's not a real vault, though. It's just some back room in a store near the docks. I think that's where they keep records, too." John's interest piqued. "You're sure?" Jalen nodded. "They always meet there late at night. And if they keep records anywhere, it's got to be there, right?" John exchanged a look with Jalen's father, who sighed. "That's risky. If they catch you—" "They won't," John interrupted. "But if what Jalen says is true, this might be exactly what we need." Jalen's father hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right, but if you're doing this, you're not going in alone. I know a couple of people who've been waiting for a chance to fight back." John raised an eyebrow. "You trust them?" "As much as I can trust anyone in this town," the man said. John considered it for a moment, then nodded. "Fine, we move now, before they have a chance to cover their tracks." Jalen looked excited, but his father placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You stay here, son." "But—" "No," his father said firmly, "it's too dangerous." Jalen clenched his jaw, frustrated, but he didn't argue. John turned to Jalen's father. "Let's go." They moved quickly through the empty streets, keeping to the shadows as they approached the docks. The town was eerily silent, and John knew that meant the gang was regrouping somewhere. He needed to finish this before they got organized again. When they reached the store Jalen had described, John motioned for the others to stay back while he moved forward. The lights inside were dim, but he could see movement. He tried the door. Locked. John took a step back and kicked it in with one solid motion. The door flew open, and the startled men inside barely had time to react before John was inside, moving fast. One of them reached for a gun, but John grabbed his wrist and slammed it against the counter, making him drop it. Another lunged at him, but John ducked, driving a fist into the man's stomach before throwing him aside. Jalen's father and his friends rushed in behind him. One of them grabbed a chair and smashed it over another gang member's back, while another pinned a man against the wall. John moved toward the back room. He could hear someone scrambling inside. He pushed the door open and found a man in a suit frantically stuffing papers into a bag. "Going somewhere?" John asked. The man spun around, his face pale. I don't know what you think you're doing, but..." John grabbed the bag and dumped the contents onto the desk. Piles of money, handwritten notes, receipts, and a ledger filled with names and transactions spilled out. He picked up the ledger and flipped through it. Names, dates, payments, and at the bottom, a name that caught his attention. A police officer. John smirked. "Bingo." The man in the suit lunged for the ledger, but John shoved him back. "Not today." Jalen's father entered the room, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "Is that?" John handed him the ledger. "This is the proof we need." The older man looked at the pages, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is enough to bring them all down." John glanced at the man in the suit, who was still trembling. "Make sure he doesn't go anywhere," he said. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. John turned to Jalen's father. "Looks like the cops are finally showing up." The older man smirked. "They won't have a choice this time." John looked out the window, the weight of the night settling over him. It wasn't over yet, but this was the beginning of the end for the gang, and he was going to make sure they never terrorized this town again. John stood near the entrance of the small back room, the ledger still clutched in his hands as the sound of distant sirens echoed through the night. The room was filled with tension. Jalen's father flipped through the pages, his hands slightly shaken as he took in the names listed inside. There were payments, detailed accounts of extortion, and clear evidence of corruption linking the gang to powerful figures in the town. It was everything they needed to expose them. The man in the suit, still backed against the wall, eyed the door like a trapped animal. He was sweating, breathing hard, but John didn't take his eyes off him. He could tell the guy was calculating, trying to find a way out. John wasn't going to let that happen. Jalen's father shook his head in disbelief. "This is it. This is what we've been waiting for." John nodded. "Now we just have to make sure it gets into the right hands." A groan from the corner caught their attention. One of the gang members, still dazed from the earlier fight, was slowly pushing himself up from the floor. His lip was split and his eyes burned with rage as he glared at John. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think a few pieces of paper are going to stop us?" John tilted his head slightly. "No, but putting the right people behind bars will." The gang member sneered. "You don't get it. This town belongs to us. You can bring the cops, you can bring the press, hell, you can bring the whole damn government, and it won't matter. We always come back." John stepped forward, his presence alone enough to make the man flinch slightly. "Not this time." The gang member chuckled, blood coating his teeth. "You don't scare me, Cena." John smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you haven't been paying attention." Before the man could respond, the sirens grew louder. Flashing red and blue lights spilled through the front windows of the shop, followed by the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming. Jalen's father tensed. "They're here." John exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Let's see if they're finally ready to do their jobs." Seconds later, uniformed officers stormed inside, weapons drawn. The moment they saw the beaten gang members on the floor, their expressions shifted. Some of them looked surprised, others hesitant. But John was watching for something else. He wanted to see who among them looked nervous, who had the most to lose from what was in this ledger. A tall officer with graying hair and a decorated badge stepped forward, scanning the scene before locking eyes with John. What the hell happened here? John held up the ledger. "Evidence." The officer's gaze flickered to the book in John's hands. He took a slow breath, then looked at the battered men around the room. His jaw tightened. "Hand it over." John didn't move. His grip on the ledger remained firm. "You sure about that?" A flicker of something passed across the officer's face. He knew exactly what was in those pages. The room went silent for a moment, heavy with unspoken tension. Jalen's father stepped forward, his voice steady. "We know how deep this runs. We know who's been protecting them." The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, slowly, he turned to the other officers behind him. "Take them in." The gang members protested immediately. "This is bull—" "Shut up," the officer snapped. "I don't want to hear a damn word from you." His men hesitated only briefly before moving in, cuffing the gang members and dragging them out one by one. John watched as some of the officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly the situation was shifting. It was a house of cards, and they all knew it. The fall had begun. The officer turned back to John. That ledger. John handed it over, but his eyes didn't leave the man's face. "You'd better do the right thing." The officer took it, flipping through the pages with a grim expression. "We'll see." Jalen's father scoffed. "That's not good enough." John nodded. "If this disappears, so will your career." The officer met his gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply. "I'll make sure it gets where it needs to go." John didn't fully trust him. Not yet, but he knew the town was watching now. The people who had spent years being afraid had seen what happened tonight. If the police tried to bury this, they wouldn't get away with it. Jalen's father turned to John. "This isn't over." John nodded. "No, but it's the beginning of the end." Outside, the flashing lights of police cars painted the town in streaks of red and blue. A crowd had gathered. Shopkeepers, families, people who had spent years living under the gang's shadow. They watched in silence as the gang members were loaded into the back of police cars. Some of them looked afraid. Others looked hopeful. Jalen appeared beside John, gripping his basketball like it was his anchor. "Is it really over?" John glanced down at him, then back at the police cars pulling away. "Not yet." Jalen frowned. "Then what happens now?" John let out a breath. "Now, we see who's really willing to fight for this town." He knew it wasn't as simple as taking down one group of men. There were others. Corrupt officials, silent enablers, people who had let this happen for too long. But tonight had been a start. The gang had been broken. Their leader had been humiliated. The people had seen that fear wasn't their only option. John turned to Jalen and smiled slightly. "You did good, kid." Jalen grinned. "I didn't do anything." John shook his head. "You stood your ground. That's more than most." Jalen's father approached, watching as the crowd slowly dispersed. "So what now? You leaving town?" John glanced at the empty park where everything had started. He thought about the fear he had seen when he first arrived, the way people had scattered at the sight of the gang. Now they were standing in the streets watching. Waiting. "No," John said, "not yet." Jalen's father let out a dry chuckle. "You really don't quit, do you?" John smirked. "Not when there's still work to do." He looked up at the dark sky, the weight of the night settling over him. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time the town had a reason to believe it could win. The morning sun cast long shadows over the streets of the town, its warm glow touching the buildings that had, for too long, stood under the weight of fear. The previous night had been a turning point. The gang was in custody, their leader humiliated, and the people who had once lived in silence were now watching with something they hadn't felt in years: hope. John Cena stood near the park, his gaze sweeping over the town. The fear was still there, lingering beneath the surface, but something had shifted. The way people moved, the way they glanced around, it wasn't just caution anymore, it was curiosity. It was the beginning of something new. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You're still here." John turned to see Jalen approaching, the basketball tucked under his arm. His steps were lighter than before, his expression different, less hesitant, more confident. John smirked. "Told you I wasn't leaving yet?" Jalen grinned, bouncing the ball once. "The news is everywhere. People are talking. They're saying the gang's done, that they're really going to prison this time." John nodded. They will be. The evidence we found, it's enough to bring down everyone who protected them. It's going to take time, but they won't be coming back. Jalen's father walked up behind him, his arms crossed as he studied John. I'll admit, I didn't think you'd pull it off, but you did. John shrugged. Not just me. This town was ready to fight back. They just needed to see they could. Jalen's father exhaled, shaking his head. People are still scared, you know. Even with them locked up, they're waiting for the other shoe to drop. John glanced around at the town. He understood. Fear didn't disappear overnight. The damage left behind by years of control didn't heal in a single day. But cracks had formed in the foundation of that fear, and now it was only a matter of time before the whole thing crumbled. It's up to them now, John said. Fear only works if people let it. They've seen what happens when they stand together. That's not something you forget. Jalen dribbled the ball against the pavement, his movements more relaxed than before. You really think they'll be okay? John looked at the boy, then at his father. I do, and so will you. Jalen hesitated, then smiled. Thanks for everything. John reached up and removed his baseball cap, placing it on Jalen's head. Keep that as a reminder. You stood up when it mattered. Jalen's smile widened. He adjusted the cap, clearly proud. Jalen's father looked at John, his expression unreadable for a moment before he finally nodded. You ever need a place to stay? You got one here. John smirked. Appreciate it. He turned, taking one last look at the town. The streets, once empty at the sight of the gang, were now filled with people moving without looking over their shoulders. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fixed, but it was changing. John took a deep breath, exhaled, and started walking. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need thanks. He had done what he came to do. And now it was time to move on. Behind him, Jalen's voice rang out. Hey, Cena! John turned back. Jalen grinned. Next time you're in town, we're playing a real game of basketball. John chuckled. You're on, kid. And with that, he disappeared down the road, leaving behind a town that was no longer afraid. Fear only has power if we let it. One person stood up, but real change takes all of us. What would you do in this situation? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget, like this video, subscribe for more, and share it with your friends.